Okay, this lecture is on personality assessment. After hearing this lecture, you should appreciate the diversity of methods that are used to measure personality characteristics, understand the logic, strengths, and weaknesses of each approach, and then gain a better sense of the overall validity and range of applications of personality tests. So for the overview for the lecture today, I'm going to do an introduction to personality assessments. I'll talk about objective tests. I'll then talk about projective and implicit tests. And then I'll end with behavioral and performance measures. So personality is the field within psychology that studies the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, goals, and interests of what we would call normal individuals. However, there's been different approaches or theoretical models that have been developed for studying personality, and each has a different strategy for measuring personality. And so we could just look at two main approaches or models, which would be the humanistic and psychodynamic approach. So psychologists that would follow the humanistic approach would say that people have clear, well-defined goals and actively strive to achieve. And so it makes sense to ask them directly about themselves and what their goals are. So psychologists that want to study personality that follow the humanistic approach would use a method of measuring personality that would rely on informant self-reports. In other words, you ask people to tell you about themselves. It's a self-report methodology. In contrast, psychologists that would follow the psychodynamic approach that was popularized by Sigmund Freud would say people lack insight into their feelings and their motives and their goals. And their behaviors are influenced by factors outside of their awareness. So people are influenced by their unconscious goals and motives and drives. So if that's the case, it doesn't make sense to ask people directly about their personality or their goals or their motivations, but to instead do so through non-direct measures such as projective tests. And those projective tests would, it's thought, identify non-conscious factors that influence personality. So I'm going to review objective tests that follow the humanistic approach, as well as projective tests that follow the psychodynamic approach. So we're going to start with objective tests. So objective tests are actually the most common approach to assessing personality. They involve administering a set of questions that have standard answers. So for example, there might be true or false questions, or respondents are asked to read an item and then indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with that statement about themselves. Responses to these items are scored in a standardized or predetermined way. So, for example, if somebody gives themselves high ratings on items that assess their talkativeness, assertiveness, adventurousness, that could indicate the personality trait of extroversion. So it's important to know that the term objective refers to the method used to score people's responses, not necessarily to the person's actual responses themselves. Okay, so what that means is that the psychologist that administers the test doesn't rely on interpreting a person's answers, but simply scores responses according to a predetermined answer key. Okay, so there's a standard way of scoring. It's not up to the psychologist's interpretation. But that doesn't mean that the person's response isn't subjective. Okay, in fact, people's responses to those questions or those items can be highly subjective, that is, open to interpretation by the respondent themselves, and are influenced by a number of different biases or tendencies. So objective refers to the way in which it's scored on the part of the psychologist. Okay, so objective personality tests can be subdivided into two basic types, which are self-reports and informant reports. And the most widely used type is a self-report where people describe themselves. So I've included a link right here, and this links out to an example of a self-report of personality. So let me just see if I can go here. There we go. So this is a sample self-report of a personality measure, and this is in the NOBA module. But this will just give you a sense of what a self-report personality assessment looks like, and it could be the case that you've already completed one of these at some point in your life. Items that are included in a self-report measure may consist of just single words, like assertive, or talkative, or shy. Okay? Or they could consist of short phrases, like we see here. I get upset easily. I enjoy being part of a group. Or actually here we've got full sentences. So whether it's just a single word, like an adjective, or whether it's a short phrase, or whether it's a sentence, people are generally asked to provide the extent to which they agree that that word or sentence describes them. Okay, so people are just, and in this particular assessment, are asked to give their extent of agreement on a 5-point scale. And then you can see this is an objective test because there's a standard answer key, and there's a standard way to score the responses where the different questions are summed up, and then that will give the respondent a score on the big 5 personality dimensions or traits, okay, with higher scores indicating a higher level or stronger level of that particular trait. So if you've never done a self-report of your personality, this would be one example, but there's other big 5 assessments that you can take on the web as well. Okay, so there are several advantages of self-report, and I think the first one is that self-report capitalizes on self-knowledge. So after all, who really knows more about you than yourself? So you have access to information that other people don't. And so that's an advantage. You can describe yourself and you can report on yourself better than other people. That's a main advantage. In most situations, that is. Second, it's a relatively simple, easy, and cost-effective way to assess a person's personality. As you can see, just being able to take a questionnaire on the web, or before the days of the internet, a paper and pencil survey, it's very easy and very simple to administer these tests to a single person or to a large number of people. Because there's a predetermined answer key, it's very easy. It doesn't take much time at all to score responses and to give people a score on whatever aspect of personality is being assessed. So they're very easy to administer. There are, of course, some drawbacks. The first would have to do with using self-reports in high-stakes testing situations. So self-raters may be motivated to present themselves in an overly favorable or socially desirable way. And this is particularly so in a high stakes testing situation where an assessment is used to make an important decision. So, for example, in a job interview or an interview for graduate school or a situation like that. So, in these situations, a person's self report of their personality, of their motivations, of their goals, might be skewed towards more favorable characteristics. In other words, they might present themselves as more conscientious than they really are. Okay, so there can be a drawback of using self-reports in high stakes testing situations because people might be motivated to misrepresent their true personality. And relatedly, um, personality ratings from self-reports often reflect a self-enhancement bias. So, in other words, people are motivated to ignore or at least downplay some of their less desirable characteristics and focus on their more positive attributes. And so, self enhancement bias happens anyway, where people kind of focus more and play up their more desirable characteristics and downplay their less desirable characteristics. And that self enhancement bias is particularly pronounced in a high stakes testing scenario when people know that the decision will be used for some important outcome. And then a third drawback is what is known as the reference group effect. And this is the idea that our self ratings are subject to a reference group effect, which is that we base our perceptions of ourself, at least in part, on how we compare to other people in our own reference group. Okay, and so by reference group, we tend to mean our group of friends, our group of peers, our people that are comparable to us. Here's one example. If you're being asked about how conscientious you are, maybe how responsible or how seriously you take your responsibilities or duties, a reference group effect would suggest that you might see yourself as relatively conscientious if you compare yourself to your friends who might not be very conscientious at all, even though you're not very conscientious in an absolute sense. So by comparing yourself to others, you might say to yourself, well, compared to my friends, I'm quite conscientious. I generally do my schoolwork. I generally do what my parents or teachers or authorities ask of me. So yeah, I'm super conscientious relative to my friends that don't do any of that. But that is basing one's own perceptions on a reference group versus some absolute standard. So that's the reference group effect. Okay, so the second type of objective testing doesn't use self-reports, but rather uses ratings from informants. And so an informant report asks someone who knows the individual to describe the personality of that person. So in the cases of children or adolescents, informants are most likely to be parents or teachers. In studies of older participants, informants might be their friends, their roommates, somebody that they're dating, their spouse. But if they're old enough, they can actually ask their children to do it, or of course, if they're employed, they can ask their boss. So there's many different types of informants that can be used for the purpose of providing a rating or an assessment of somebody's personality. The assessment that an informant gets is very similar in format to what a self-report would look like. So the items might consist of single words, adjectives, short phrases, complete sentences. In fact, all you really have to do is slightly adjust the language of whatever the self-report survey is, and it's very easy to convert the self-report to an informant report. I've just included as a picture a couple that's been married for a long time, and so both of these individuals would be able to provide accurate ratings of their respective spouse because they've known each other for a long time. Okay, so there's many pros of using informant ratings. So one is that they're a valid source of information. So they can be especially useful when getting a self-report is impossible, either because the person that you want to assess is a child, or they might be a adult that is cognitively impaired. Another advantage is that you can use this information to and combine an informant report with a self-report, so it provides another source of information. And then a third one is that you often get a better sample of behavior. So by asking numerous informants, you can get a sense of a person's personality across different relationships and across different settings or domains in one's life. So the reports that friends provide are likely to be different than the reports that a boss provides, and this suggests that people have different personalities or behave in different ways in different aspects of their life. So it provides a better sample of behavior. Of course, there's also drawbacks as well. And so one is that depending on the informant that is asked, that particular informant might have limited access to seeing a full range of behaviors from the particular person. So a boss, for example, is only going to be able to see that particular person's personality at work, and perhaps only under a limited number of circumstances in a work setting. So the drawback here is that any particular informant will have a limited access to behaviors. And certainly, all informants have limited access in the sense that they can only report on what they observe, whereas with a self-report, we have full access to our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. Okay, so all informants only have access to what they can see. There's other cons, and some specific ones have to do with using particular informants. So, for instance, when parents are used as informants, there's something known as the sibling contrast effect, which is that parents tend to overrate or overemphasize differences between their children. So parents tend to view their children as being so dissimilar to one another because they tend to rate or view their behaviors in contrast to another person. So rather than kind of providing a objective view of a particular child, they look at that child's behavior in comparison or in contrast to another sibling. Other drawbacks would come from informants that could be teachers or bosses. And so there's a letter of recommendation effect, which is informants that would provide a rating that would be used in some sort of a high stakes outcome, like getting accepted to a graduate school or providing a letter of recommendation or reference for a job, often provide a rating that is of the person that is overly positive. And the idea is that in order to help a person get into a school or to get a job, you don't quite tell the whole truth, and so you downplay or don't include at all anything that's negative and only accentuate the positive. And so the letter of recommendation, in fact, is really just the finding that informant ratings can be overly positive when used for these high stakes outcomes. And then there's the honeymoon effect, which is that dating partners or newlyweds tend to see their partner in a much more positive light than they might kind of be accurate. And so the idea here is that when first dating or when first married, we're very motivated to see our partner in a positive light. And so when we ask a dating partner or a spouse to be an informant, it's a good idea for the psychologist to get some sense of how long they've been together, not just to get a sense of how accurate the ratings might be in terms of the sample of behaviors that they've been able to see, but to acknowledge that there's this honeymoon effect where we're motivated in the picture here because we just got married, and it would be cognitively dissonant to be married to somebody that we didn't think was the kind of the greatest person in the world. So there's a kind of a partner enhancement due to this honeymoon effect. All right, so in addition to the source of the report, so either a self-report or an informant report, there's at least two other important dimensions on which personality tests differ. And the first concerns how comprehensive a test is. So many widely used personality tests are designed only to assess a single core attribute. So for example, there's been psychological scales and tests that have been developed to assess self-esteem. And that's it. We're just going to measure person's self-esteem. Or narcissism, or authoritarianism, or the need for closure, the need for cognition, just to name a few. So they differ in their comprehensiveness, and that some tests are only designed to assess a single attribute or trait, and that's kind of this single puzzle piece. Alternatively, there's been a number of what are called omnibus inventories that have been designed to measure personality as a whole. So in the previous lecture, we learned about models of personality like the Big Five, as well as the hexaco model. And so there's been inventories that have been designed to test not just a single attribute of personality, but rather personality as a whole, according to the Big Five or the hexaco, just to name a few there as well. So we can also talk about a second way in which personality tests differ, which has to do with the breadth or the generality of the measure. So kind of similar to the single attribute or omnibus inventory, personality tests differ in the emphasis that they put on certain characteristics. So many models, like the Big Five, emphasize broad or big traits, such as neuroticism or extroversion. So for example, the Big Five inventory contains very brief scales that assess the broad traits of neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. However, other models get more specific, and they divide these broad dimensions into several distinct yet correlated component traits. So in a previous lecture, we've talked about facets. So extroversion contains several specific facets, such as dominance, sociability, being adventurous. So there's many instruments that were designed primarily to assess these more specific characteristics. And then, you've got some models that are designed to provide coverage of both the general as well as the specific. So for instance, there are certain personality measures like the NEOPI-3, which you don't need to remember the name, but just to give you one example, which has to measure a particular Big Five dimension like extroversion would include 6 specific facet scales like gregariousness, assertiveness, positive emotion, excitement seeking, etc. And they can be combined together. So those specific facets can then be combined together to yield a score on the broad dimension. So you get both the broad as well as the specific if you'd like to see the detail, so to speak. So it's just a different approach. Is what is the goal? Is the goal to assess somebody's broad personality, like that very short inventory of the big five that I presented earlier, where the goal is just to give kind of an overall score on these broad dimensions? Or is the goal to try to be more specific and measure personality at the facet level? So we can talk about the breadth or the generality of the inventory. All right, so that was objective tests. Let's move on to projective and implicit tests. So following the psychodynamic tradition, some approaches to personality are based on the belief that important thoughts, feelings, and motives come from outside a person's conscious awareness. So projective tests were originally based on something called the projective hypothesis. And this is when people are asked to interpret stimuli that can be understood in a variety of ways. Their responses will be influenced by non-conscious needs, feelings, and experiences. So two prominent examples of projective tests are the Rorschach inkblot test, as well as the thematic apperception test, and I'll describe both of these in some amount of detail. All right, so let's start with the Rorschach. So the Rorschach is a projective psychological test that uses a person's interpretation of 10 standard either black or colored ink blots as a way to assess their personality traits and emotional tendencies. It was created in 1921 by a Swiss psychologist named Hermann Rorschach. His intention in developing the test was not actually to measure personality so much as to create a test that could be used in the diagnosis of schizophrenia. That being said, the Rorschach is a very popular test today, and some surveys of clinical psychologists by the American Psychological Association have revealed that as many as 82% of clinical psychologists have used the Rorschach at least occasionally. So the Rorschach is being used for much more than just the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it's being used as a projective test of personality. So people give their responses to looking at these ink blots. What exactly do psychologists that are trying to interpret their answers look for? Well, certainly one is how respondents describe the image. There's certain responses that are common to each of the ink blots. So there can be there have been code books that have been developed to try to identify whether a common response is given. But that's not the only thing. Like another thing that a psychologist might look for is how long a respondent takes to respond. So taking a very long time before offering a response to the ink blot might indicate that they're surprised or shocked by what they're seeing in the ink blot. So to just go into a little bit more detail, the first card in the Rorschach test is actually what is pictured here. It's a black and white symmetrical image, and respondents frequently describe this as some animal shape, usually a bat or a butterfly or a moth. But seeing some other animal or a human shape is also a common response in several of the 10 cards. The third ink blot, not pictured here, but it's often described as two human figures that are engaged in some sort of an interaction. And so responses to the third card are thought to provide information about how the individual interacts with other people. A relatively fast response might indicate that they're at ease with other people and they're comfortable in their social relationships. But a delayed response might mean that they struggle with social interactions. But who knows? It's open to some amount of interpretation. Okay. All right, so that's the Rorschach. And I'll go into some additional detail about that, but I just want to describe the thematic apperception test next. So the thematic apperception test, or the TAT, consists of 20 different cards which contain ambiguous pictures. Okay, so these pictures are presented to a subject, and then the respondent has to come up with a story about each of the pictures. And so, for example, a subject is asked to describe what's the present situation, what's going on, what is the character or the person that's pictured there, what are they thinking, what are they feeling, maybe what are some of the events that could have led up to the story, how does the story end, what is the final outcome. So what you see in this picture here is a boy that is huddled next to a couch, and then there's this ambiguous object which is placed right here, and we don't know what it could be. It's been described in several ways as a set of keys. Some people will see a gun. So, really, what the psychologist is looking for is what's the story that's being told. And, they often will focus in on several things, including whether the story identifies there's a protagonist of the story, in other words, a hero. What is that hero? What do they need? What are their goals? What are their desires? Does the story have a happy ending for the protagonist? So these are some of the themes that the psychologist that is trying to interpret the story will look for. So as you can see, there's a lot of interpretation for both the Rorschach as well as the TAT. And so that's one issue. And so in comparison to objective tests, there's a lot of interpretation, and they also tend to be, these projective tests are somewhat cumbersome and labor intensive to administer. The biggest challenge really though has been to develop a reliable and valid way to score all the possible responses that can be generated by each respondent that's giving a story or describing what they see. And so for this reason in particular, that there's so many different types of responses and how to score it and make sense of it, the validity, which is basically how good a job the Rorschach does at measuring personality, has been a matter of controversy. So many reviews, professional reviews of the usefulness of the Rorschach, has basically concluded that it doesn't adequately predict most personality characteristics. It doesn't really predict psychological disorders. It doesn't predict the potential for violence. So these are all things that like forensic psychologists have tried to look at, or personality or clinical psychologists. But it doesn't do a very good job predicting personality or different psychological disorders. If anything, it's been accepted that the test does have value as a measure of thought disorders, which are common in schizophrenia. And that makes sense because that was the original reason that Hermann Rorschach developed the Rorschach test, was a diagnostic tool for schizophrenia. So if anything, it works for schizophrenia, but applied to other psychological disorders like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, or just good old-fashioned normal personality, doesn't really work. So there's really limited predictive ability to assess personality. And the other thing in terms of this unsatisfactory information, the idea here is that it doesn't really provide any information about a person that a normal kind of objective self-report personality measure, or even a measure of personality disorder, could provide. So Rorschach doesn't really give information above and beyond what a standard personality test will give you. So it really has limited value, unfortunately, for measuring personality. Um, on the other hand, there's better evidence of the value of the TAT. In particular, um, the TAT has been used to measure a personality variable called the need for achievement. It's been widely used to measure that particular trait in particular. So, need for achievement refers to an individual's desire for significant accomplishment, mastering skills, having control, and setting high standards for oneself. So, um, the TAT has been able to be used as a valid measure of need for achievement, and it's been shown to predict an individual's risk-taking propensity, the extent to which they engage in innovative or novel tasks, the extent to which they set goals and take responsibility for their own decisions and actions. And the TAT also provides information above and beyond what objective measures are able to provide. So the thematic apperception test has been used as a valid measure, particularly of need for achievement, because it's been shown to predict behavior and to predict above and beyond just what a standard self-report objective test can predict. All right, so another type of personality assessment that's been used more in, I'd say, the last 20 years are implicit tests. So implicit tests are based on the assumption that people form automatic, in other words, implicit associations between certain concepts based on their previous experience and behavior. So these tests are administered over the computer, and it's assumed that an individual's reaction time or response is faster when two strongly associated categories share one response key. So, for instance, different words are presented. Different adjectives are then paired with two different categories, like self and other. And so there will be a target word, and the goal is to see whether the target word fits one of the categories. And the idea is that when you have somebody that would say be anxious, and anxiety is paired with the self, they will more quickly categorize the word afraid as an anxiety word when it's connected to the self versus when calmness and anxiety are flip-flopped. So this is a way to look and see whether the self is paired with the concept of anxiety and whether that pairing is stronger than the pairing of self and calm. So the evidence for whether these measures predict anything is still relatively sparse, but the results do suggest that implicit tests of the Big Five personality have been shown to predict behavior above and beyond the objective tests. So this is another way to assess personality more from an implicit or unconscious perspective. And the idea here is that it tries to overcome some of the limitations of self-report, knowing that there are certain traits that might be subject to a self-enhancement bias where people don't want to report that they experience anxiety or that they're ever afraid. And so using this implicit test is thought to be a way to get at how strongly those concepts are associated and get kind of overcome the limitation of self-report. All right, finally, I'll talk about behavioral and performance measures. So a final approach is to measuring personality is to infer personality characteristics from direct samples of behavior. So, just to give you some ideas of what's been done, as one example, researchers have had opposite sex pairs of participants come into the laboratory and engage in a 5-minute getting acquainted conversation, much like you see here in the picture. They'll have raters watch these interactions and then score the participants on various personality characteristics. Okay, so that's one thing that can be done. So it's essentially you're looking at how people behave in that situation, and then they're scored on different personality characteristics like the Big Five. Another example of a behavioral measure would be to have participants wear something called an electronically activated recorder and then naturally record the sounds in a person's environment over a 2-day period. Scores that are based on the recordings, you can then compare. Basically, one thing that would tell you is how frequently a person would talk over a 2-day period. And then you could look at how frequently that person talks and compare that to their self ratings of talkativeness, as well as informant ratings of talkativeness. And indeed, what happens is when you have people wear these things, there's often a strong correlation between self ratings, informant ratings, and then the actual amount that people talk. And then, just as a third example, there's actually been researchers that have gotten college students permission to go into their bedroom and do an assessment of their personality based on what their dorm room looks like. You never would have gotten me to agree to do this when I was in college, but apparently they get people to do it. But anyway, they're able to raters are able to come up with an assessment of the person on the Big Five, and they found that the observer ratings were actually significantly correlated with participants' own self ratings on the Big Five traits. And so follow-ups indicated that conscientious students had cleaner rooms, whereas students that were higher in openness to experience had a wider variety of like books and magazines. So there are behavioral indications of the personality trait. All right, so there's certainly pros and cons of both. So in terms of pros, because the behavior is sampled directly, the approach is not subject to the types of response biases that we often find with self-reports and even informant reports. So we've just got behaviors. Another advantage is that the approach allows people to be studied in their daily lives and in their natural environments. So we get to see what people naturally do. And then, because they're behavioral approaches, they assess what people actually do as opposed to what they think or feel. So at the same time, this approach has some disadvantages. It's very labor intensive. It takes time, it takes energy. So to be able to set up and have people come into a laboratory environment and then code their behaviors or have different raters set up appointments with people to see their dorm rooms, it takes time and effort. It's much more labor intensive than just giving a survey or an objective test. Also, similar to projective tests, behavioral measures generate a lot of data that can be difficult to score reliably. So you really need to have a very well-structured way to score or code what you're looking at or looking for. And because of how difficult it can be to obtain the data, even research studies that are the most ambitious tend to get relatively small samples of behavior, and these samples of behavior might not be totally representative of a person's overall behavior or personality. So, for instance, just because your dorm room looks a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that, that's your entire personality. You could have somebody that doesn't have a particularly tidy dorm room because it's been a stressful week at school, but that person could be very conscientious. Um, or as another example, when trying to measure somebody's personality during the getting acquainted conversation, there's going to be all kinds of temporary factors uh, associated with the moment, like stress levels or level of excitement, that are unique to that moment and maybe not completely representative of a person's personality overall. So, um, but what I hope you've been able to take away is with objective tests, with projective tests, and with behavioral measures, there's different pros and cons associated with both, and or with all three, and they all give you a somewhat different way of assessing personality. And several can be used in conjunction with each other.